to Learn Astrology with Mary. My name's Mary English, and today we have a fabulous guest. We've got Philip Graves, and we're going to be talking to him about his astrology library and other things. So welcome, Philip. Lovely to see you over the internet. We have met face to face, but this is over the internet today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Mary, and thank you very much for inviting me onto your show. It's a great pleasure.
Now, what I want to get straight in there. So, you've been to university and you've got a degree. Well, you're way up the scale to me because I didn't go to university. So, well done you. And you've got a BA Hons in French. Is that right? From Hull University. But you've also studied Swedish, advanced Swedish, German, Spanish, and Latin. What got you so interested in languages to start with? Where did that start?
I think it probably started in my early childhood because I was introduced to French by my mother. She was very good at French and she taught us with this kind of picture book when I was probably about 4 years old, or maybe 5, but it was very, very early, and I just loved it. So I took to French like a duck to water, really. And then for various reasons, I was moved into the private school system when I was 7, and the result of that was that I also had to learn Latin for 4 years from the ages of 9 to 13. And although that was much tougher, a little bit more abstract than French, I still found it interesting, and I'm kind of grateful for that education in the sense that I'm now finding, since I got into astrology, that there are all these still untranslated Latin texts from the Renaissance time, in addition to the earlier ones that mostly have been translated, now the medieval and ancient ones. And it's really fascinating to be able to look at those in the original language and work out what they're talking about.
Absolutely, because it's all very well saying use Google Translate, but you can't put an elderly text in it to do that. So we will be talking. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about your library in a minute, but I just want to do a bit of background there as well.
Yeah.
And so you said that you originally got into astrology in 1995 in the summer. So what kicked that off? How did you even know about astrology to start with?
Okay, well, I suppose initially I had very, very little knowledge of astrology, and there was nobody in my family who studied it. The only thing which I was really exposed to in my childhood was the kind of media sun sign forecasts, Russell Grant on TV, obviously, and then Jonathan Caner in Today, and subsequently in the Mail. And my dad did get the Mail for a while, and he used to quite like Jonathan Caner's column, but that was just in the background, and I didn't really know anything about proper astrology beyond that. So it wasn't until I stumbled upon a copy of Linda Goodman's Love Signs in a holiday let that my mother had taken me to for a few days before my second year at university, and that I first began to kind of see natal astrology, or at least a sun sign mediated version of natal astrology described. And that got me curious. Then the following summer, a friend of my father's called Joe Hopkins, an art teacher, that he had met in Shropshire where we still lived at that time. She got into a discussion with me about Linda Goodman, and she also had her own copy of Blood Signs plus Sun Signs that she lent me over the summer. And she could see I was really enjoying learning about the sun signs and the synastic aspects, and she decided to buy me a beginner's book to learn more from. So
Can you remember what the beginner's book was?
Yes, it was called Love, Life and Destiny, or Life, Love and Destiny, as the case may be, by Barbara Dunn and Archie Dunlop. So.
Oh, okay, I've heard of that. Okay, I haven't read it, but I've heard it.
No.
And so what age were you at that point then? How old would you be?
Let's think. I was 21.
Right, okay, so you haven't even got as far as the Saturn return then, and you're getting into astrology.
Not even close.
Ooh, no, right, okay. So there you go. So you read those. It's lovely to hear that you did Donna Cully was your first, but Linda Goodman as your first books, because I did as well. That was my first introduction, because that was called Sun Signs. Linda Goodman's Sun Signs. Yeah, I can't remember how I stumbled over it, but I've still got my copy. And people later on, when they've learnt loads of astrology, sort of rather look down their noses at Linda Goodman and the whole sun sign astrology thing. I mean, we'll be here forever if we talk about that. It's like, well, I still do sun sign astrology, and I do a column in it, and I think it's great as an introduction, and it's fabulous. But it's so exciting when you find out about the other stuff, though, that there is a chart and the moon. So when you were reading this Barbara book, did it in describing there actually how to construct a chart?
It did in a simplified way because it was really designed for beginners and it was a single volume. I think they used a simplified tables, moon tables, rather than a full ephemeris with every single month.
Mhm.
And so, and also it used a simplified ascendant finder based on a visual image. So that was a good stepping stone, but it wasn't accurate to degrees in terms of ephemeris quality. So I went beyond that. Only a few months later, I was back at half term in Shrewsbury. I went into Waterstones, and there was a copy of Parker's Astrology there. And of course, that has, if anybody who knows that, that has its own very detailed ephemeris with the positions, I think, on every day of every month for the sun, the moon, and the planets, including
Wow.
Pluto. So that
Uh,
was a brilliant way to take it further and just to get a more accurate chart. And of course, the interpretive material in the first book I'd read before that can still be looked at in application to a more accurately calculated chart. But the Parker's material was really interesting as well. And so those are my two books beyond sun signs that I used mostly in the first year that I was studying astrology. I also bought a reprint of The Astrological Tarot by Georges Moucheri, a French author of the mid-20th century. And that was originally a French book, but it was translated into English, and it was a reprint English version. That was quite curious. It was difficult for me to know what to make of that at the time because it was so different from what I was reading in these two beginner level books. But it was quite interesting as a supplementary source of interpretations. But at the end of that year, I should say, that academic year in the summer, I then went up to Edinburgh, where my mother lived at the time, and I
mhm.
went to a local bookshop there called Body and Soul, which at the time had a very good section of new astrology books. And the Waterstones branches in the city also had others, and I ended up getting sort of 20 or 30 by the end of that summer and ordering 30 more by the end of the year. So
Oh my goodness, you jumped straight in
yeah,
there.
so by the end of 1996, I was up to 60 books just like that.
And what was it about it that, so I mean, I know what it was for me, but what was it about astrology that was so interesting for you when you first started researching it?
It was relating what was described to the psychology of people I'd met and seeing the likeness. I mean, if it wasn't for that, I probably wouldn't have been so engrossed. If I hadn't been able to read what was said about certain placements and actually relate that to people I've known or to myself, as the case may be, in a way that I could recognize, then I would have thought, well, this could be completely random, but it wasn't.
Mm.
And so I was curious because I like to understand reality at deeper levels in any case. Before I got into astrology, I was very much into interpreting dreams, and that was an interest of mine. And I think that for me it was almost an extension of that curiosity about understanding life on a deeper level, understanding human psychology on a deeper level than was commonly recognized.
Mm. Oh, that's your Mercury talking, isn't it?
Could
Mercury and
be, could
Pisces,
well be.
yeah. And so there you are. You're starting to learn astrology, and you're getting a grasp of it. You're buying some books and stuff. And then where did it go after that? Because eventually it's way into the future now. In 2001, you're doing the MSN communications boards.
That's right. It was in 2001. I hadn't really been doing much more in astrology for the previous few years because after graduating from Hull in 1997, I then very much wanted to get into writing and producing my own songs, and so I was very focused on music for a few years. And obviously, I know music is something you very much enjoy yourself, so I'm sure you can relate to that in your own way.
Definitely, yeah.
And then I stumbled onto the MSN chat service online and happened to get into an astrology room there, and there was this really nice group of people, quite international. There were a lot of them in America, And from getting into that community, I was then eventually invited to become assistant manager of a related website on the MSN Communities Network, which then became relabeled MSN Groups around the end of that year, 2001. And because I was often in assistant management position there, I decided, well, I might as well do something useful that helps the other members to learn more astrology. So I decided to start writing articles about different facets of astrology, very much at an introductory level, an educational level, but an accurate one, but not an excessively intricate one. And those are the articles you now see in the section of the articles page on my current website, astrolearn.com, and that refers to them as legacy introductory articles on astrology. So I wrote all of those between 2002 and 2004. So I wrote them all when I was in my 20s still, just.
Wow. Oh, wow. Yeah, because there's loads of writing going on in your family. I mean, your great, is it one great uncle or two great uncles is the famous poet Robert Graves?
One great uncle was particularly a famous poet, Robert Graves, and I had other authors in the family as well, mostly more obscure. My great grandfather, Alfred Percival Graves, was an Irish folklorist and poet. He wrote a quite popular song called Father O'Flynn, which you would have to speak to a very cultured Irish person nowadays to have any kind of response to that name, because most people won't have heard of it over here. But at one time, it was quite a well-known poet, quite a well-known song in Ireland.
Wow. Yeah, and then your dad's a writer as well. He's written 20 books. Yeah, so there's writing in the flipping family then. Is there a lot of competition because of that?
There isn't really competition, no, but it's something which, I mean, I suppose because when I was growing up, my dad was a professional biographer. He then branched out into guides to home computers in the 1980s, which was a bit of a strange turn, but it was really because he found it much more useful having a word processor than a typewriter for preparing drafts of his books. It was a more efficient process. That's how he got into it. But then he thought, well, while I'm here, the user guides to these computers are really, really hard to get into. I want to write something which is straightforward and makes it easier for people to follow how to program these computers. That's what he did then. But no, you're right. And I used to write a lot of stories and songs, songs of devotion to my toy cat, even when I was a child. So I just naturally took to writing. I don't think it was particularly because my father was a writer. It was just something that came to me, maybe because I have a love of languages as well. That was part of it. But certainly, if you do have, I think there's definitely something to be said in psychology. If you do have somebody in your family, in an old generation of your family, who has done something professionally, it kind of makes you feel, well, that's possible.
Yeah, it does open possibilities. I mean, my older brother was an antique book dealer. My mother's
Yeah, yeah.
self-published 6 or 7 books. My older sister has, she's got creative writing, this, that, and the other, and she's 6 novels, I think she's written, and she's the reader in creative writing at Bath University. So I've been surrounded, and then I've got a younger sister who's an artist. So in my family, we're a pretty creative lot, and nobody really bothered about the fact that I got into. My mother didn't understand astrology. My dad had already passed by then, but there was never any sort of query about it. And also, when I did write, and I have written, I'm still writing. When I first book was published, my mum was so excited about it because she'd done it herself, but I'd been published, and so that was sort of like family thing together. It was, but the whole book thing's great.
Yes.
So there you are. You're doing the MSN communities, and you're an editor for them or a manager for them. It's a pretty responsible job.
I was to begin with, I was an assistant manager. I mean, how MSN Communities worked was that every single group on the network was privately created by somebody, but then that person would take responsibility for making content, making a community, attracting people. And so all the principles that govern attracting people to websites today were valid back then, 20 years ago. You would have to create attractive visual designs and layouts and incitations for people to join the group and so on, which was all free, and it was a totally non-profit venture. It was there were no charges involved. There was nothing we were selling. We were simply educating and sharing. It was a community.
Wow.
And I very much enjoyed that, and I enjoyed meeting all the other people that I interacted with there. I mean, any big community online, you know how it is with big forums. Occasionally you get personality clashes and arguments, and then you have to exercise diplomacy to resolve them in a mutually satisfactory way. And so there were occasional tough moments where people disagree with each other or even with the management about something. And I was quite glad after 5 years to step away from that in 2006, which was after my daughter Natalie was born. And I had more responsibilities then. I just kind of felt, well, I can't really handle constantly monitoring the message boards and dealing with people's arguments
Yeah, well, there's
anymore. So
there's
I felt
loads
I'd
of
done my
those
bit.
online.
So
Yeah.
I stepped away, and then 3 years later, MSN pulled the plug on the whole service in any case. So that was the end of that.
And how did that feel then? So all that work that you put on there, did you manage to save it before it all disappeared? I mean, I'd be crying if I'd written loads of
Yeah,
articles
I
before they
saved all
disappeared
my
overnight.
articles. Yes, I downloaded all the articles and saved them, and that's why I was able to recycle those old articles into Astrolearn, with a disclaimer that they were articles written when I was in my 20s, and obviously I had fewer books and less historical knowledge than I do now. So they would probably read to an expert in the history of astrology today as being a little bit elementary, perhaps a little bit simplistic even. But I think for somebody who is learning astrology for the first time from a modern perspective, they still are a valuable introduction. I like to think so anyway.
Well, absolutely. I don't think learning astrology should be difficult. I mean, my podcast called Learn Astrology with Mary, and I have been complimented a few times that the reason people like it is that I've made it easy. But you can make
Yes,
it, you can make
yes,
astrology as complicated as you like, but
that's true.
just get into it. It's going to be easy to start with, otherwise you're just not even going to follow it. Cool. Okay, so talk me through then. So, what inspired you to start this massive library that you've got with all these astrology books? Where did that come from?
Well, I suppose initially it was learning more about astrology, or the desire to learn more about astrology, to understand natal placements in more detail, to understand transits and progressions in more detail, that first got me to purchase more books beyond the beginner ones, which I had purchased in my first year of study. And that was merely for my own astrological education at that stage. But when I got involved in this MSN Groups community, because I'd then taken on this role of developing this knowledge base, this area of teaching pages, of articles that had to be, in my view, well researched in order to be accurate. I felt it was necessary to purchase additional sources. So over those few years, literally the first 2 or 3 years that I was involved in that group, I increased the number of astrological books I had from 60 to 300. And that was in order to have more sources to refer to and to cover more ground more comprehensively and more accurately. So having achieved that, I then thought, well, actually, I'm enjoying researching this subject and the history of it so much. I don't want to stop there, even if I'm not developing articles for this MSN Group site anymore necessarily. I still want to carry on this research project. And a couple of years later, over the rest of the 2000s, I was fortunate to receive a small amount of money, but a useful amount of money, when both my grandmothers in turn sadly passed away. And I decided to invest that in building up the collection more. So it had then become, by sort of 2010, more a library than a little private collection, with 4,000 books or so, I think, by the end of 2010.
And what number are you up to now?
About double that now, so
8,000. Oh my
5,000.
goodness. Yeah, so I've got to tell people that are listening and watching that Phillips Library is in a residential address,
Yeah.
and it's a terrace that you're in. Is that right?
It's actually a semi-detached house.
Semi, right.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you've got all of the majority of the ground floor with, because I've watched so many of your videos. You were doing little updates on, I think that was on
That's right.
YouTube at one point. You were doing little videos and you've got this shelf in and then you put that shelf in and you move this bit. And I've seen it over the years grow. It's fascinating. And so, now you've got most of the things sort of in the right place and organized and stuff, but it's all on the ground level of the house. Is that right?
Yes, all the parts which are my own collection are on the ground floor. However, I also now house, at the moment, part of the Astrological Association of Great Britain's collection, which is
Oh,
called
yeah.
the AA Archive. And because that there wasn't space for that in the existing scheme I had, well, I was able to accommodate 3 bookcases worth of that on the ground floor, but the rest is all upstairs. So my music room is now doubles as the AA Archive room. So across 2 walls, I've got the foreign language and data collections of the Astrological Association of Great Britain, and across the other wall that isn't the wall with windows, I've got my kind of sound system and everything like that. So it's a bit of a strange room. It's multi-purpose, but it does potentially mean that if somebody wants to come in and listen to an audio lecture on astrology, I've got a tape player all set up and speakers,
Oh,
so
wow.
you can do
Okay.
that as well.
Oh my goodness. Okay, you've got the total sensory experience of astrology then. How that's fab. Okay, so people obviously can book when we're out of pandemic and things are easier or whatever. People can book and actually visit this library, yes. But it's
Yes,
all owned
ideally,
by you, yeah. Apart from the Astrological Association bit,
yes,
yeah.
the rest is all owned by me. So I would say at the moment from January would be best because I have a deadline to complete a volume of essays by the end of December. So I'm going to be very, very busy on weekends between now and then. So just in terms of making sure I get that done to a satisfactory standard, I think it would be best to put off visitors until January at this stage. So
Sure, but
that's
people
fine.
can because we're going to put links to your websites as
Sure.
well because we've got AstroLearn and we've also got the library itself. So what's these essays then? Did I know about this? I don't think I did. You've got a publishing deal. What's that?
That's right. I've written over the last 9 years or so, maybe 8 years, a number of more in-depth historical essays which are looking at particular aspects of the history of astrology, but particularly within the period from the discovery of Uranus to the present day. So what we would call modern astrology, which anything from the sort of revival of the 1780s onwards is classed as modern astrology, even though probably to somebody who's learned astrology since the 1970s, anything from 1780s doesn't sound very modern. In terms of astrology as a whole, it is modern.
Mm-mm-mm.
So I've looked at, for instance, the discovery of Uranus and how it was incorporated by astrologers into their scheme of things, what the early interpretations were. That was one essay. I looked at the earliest published assessments of the um, sign, sorry, the sign rulership of Neptune and Pluto, and wrote 2 essays on that. And they were all based on looking at the primary sources which I've collected. So
Mm.
a lot of material which is quite scarce and it wouldn't be easy to find in a public library. So I've used the material gathered from the library to conduct some original historical research into the modern period. And over the last several years, some of those have been published in, one or two have been published in the Astrological Journal of the Astrological Association. One was published in the Career Astrologer, um, which is the publication of the um, Organisation of Professional Astrologers, and most of the rest were published in Infinity Astrological Magazine, which is
Mm.
currently suspended. That was produced by Smiljana Gavrančić from Serbia. And there are a few which haven't been published yet. So there will be a few essays in the volume which haven't been published anywhere at all, and all the others will be compiled.
Cool. And who's publishing this for you?
I've got a publishing deal with Revelor Press, which is run by Dr. Jennifer Zart, who is also nowadays the editor-in-chief of Mountain Astrology magazine.
And what country are they based in? In the UK or?
In the United States of America.
Oh, in the US. Wow, cool. Get that. So you're going to have some essays. Ooh, exciting. Good. And this is all going to be in one volume. And do you know what the title of the volume is going to be?
No, that will ultimately be for the publisher to
Right.
decide what the most marketable title would be. Something along the lines of Essays on the History of Modern Astrology, but that's a working title and it could be adjusted. So.
Yes, because I don't think there can't be that much written about modern. I mean, because I know when I've been researching the outer planets, I'm heavily into Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and I live in Bath, where we've got the museum to the discovery of Uranus, and now is now my mind's gone blank. The name that discovered William Herschel, beg your pardon. So we've got the Herschel Museum in Bath, which I've visited numerous times. Yeah, and then I was going through some of the books that I've got, like physical books that I've got. What is it that people wrote about when it was first discovered? How did astrologers do it? I mean, you've got access to the things that were written at the time, not people that are writing later on, like in the 50s and stuff, sort of referring back to it. Oh, so that's cool, isn't it? And then tell me about this new book. I just saw on your Facebook page you've got the most fantastically elderly book that's just arrived. Tell me about this book.
Right. Oh, that is by the Italian astrologer Girolamo Cardano. I'm not expert at pronouncing Italian names, so apologies if that's incorrect, but I think that's approximately right. And he was one of the great Renaissance astrologers of the 16th century, and he was also quite prominent in Italy and in public life in various ways, but he's had his biography written at least 2 or 3 times. There's plenty of information about him out there. He's a fascinating character, and this was the second edition of one of his 2 major astrological works. He was really a polymath. He wrote books on numerous different subjects. He was an expert mathematician. He wrote a book on ingenious mechanical devices of some kind, and he also wrote 2 major works on astrology, one of which was in its first edition called Libelli Duo, meaning 2 little books, and it was massively extended for the definitive second edition of 1547 called Libelli Quinque, 5 little books, and that's the edition which I've just purchased, and it's been something I've wanted for a long time because his other major work on astrology, which was a commentary on the Tetrabiblos of Claudius Ptolemy. I've had that one since the 2000s, late 2000s. So it's really just in terms of completing the reference frame of his 16th century works. It's something I've wanted to have this other book of his in an original 16th century edition ever since then.
So it's the real paper that it was made of from
That's
1500. Right. Is it 1500 and something?
1547. It's now the oldest book in the library by a margin of 6 years, 100 years earlier than the first edition of Lilly's Christian Astrology.
Which you have as well, yeah. Oh, but just imagine like the paper being hundreds of years old. And I think you put on your Facebook page that it wasn't that sort of damaged or not too creased or too squashed or stuff. You thought it was
in surprisingly good condition on the whole. I mean, there were no underlinings or major blemishes that I could find, except there was a small burn hole through. In these very old books, they have these little letters sometimes at the foot of the page which identify how it should be collated by the binder. And so there's one which has something like M, M, I, and just between the second M and the first I, there's a small burn hole, but that's the only serious fault I could find. So it's not affecting the main text. You know, quite often in books of that age, and even on ones in the 17th century and later, you find insect damage through the text on the main pages, and there's none of that in this case. So it was quite fortunate because it was a fairly minimal description that the bookseller gave, but the bookseller was a member of one of the major antiquarian book dealers organizations, and there is this tradition, particularly in Europe, that if a book is in basically good condition, you just list it and you only describe major faults if there are any. So they have a slightly different way of doing things from American and British booksellers, who tend to be a little bit more comprehensive in detailing all the faults.
Oh, that's amazing. And so, okay, so he wrote this and he lived in Italy. So it's obviously it's written in Latin, right?
It's in Latin, the whole thing.
Because most things would have been written in Latin then, even in the UK. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, there wasn't there wasn't much on astrology of substance written in the UK in the 16th
Right.
century, or rather, it wasn't even the UK then, was it? It was probably
No.
England and Wales and Scotland and
Yeah.
plus separately Ireland. But no, I think the European um, astrological movement was much bigger in the 16th century. Right at the end of the century, we find an original medical treatise introduced um, by an anonymous author called G.C. and appended to the second edition of the English language translation of Claude Darrio's book, A Brief and Easy Introduction to the Astrological Judgments of the Stars. The first English language edition of that was in 1583, and then the 1598 edition, you get an original English language medical treatise. Now, that's the first substantial English language original work on astrology I'm aware of in print, but I
Mhm,
can't think of any of comparable age that were written by British authors in Latin.
mhm,
It's just that I think the English astrological community took off much more strongly in the 17th century, and the literary output of astrologers in the UK, or Britain as it was, um, flourished far more after the appearance of the first edition of Christian Astrology in 1647. You then get all these other authors such as John Gadbury and Henry Coley and Joseph Blagrave and John Partridge producing their own original treatise of astrology in the late and mid 17th century. But prior to that, the astrological literature that was being produced that was original was almost entirely published in continental Europe and written by continental European writers. Some of them were
mhm.
Italian, quite a lot of them were Italian actually in the 16th century, others were German, a few were French.
Mm. And it's marvelous to to own something, because you must start thinking, what cupboard has that been stuck in? Has it? How did it travel from Italy to? Did it come on a boat? Did it go on an airplane? Whose handbag has it been in?
It was purchased from a bookseller in Prague, so you have to wonder,
Right.
how long has it been in the Czech Republic? When did it move from
Mm.
Italy? It could have been there for centuries, for all I know.
Absolutely. I mean, these are the things that my brother used to do with him being an antique book dealer, stuff. I mean, he obviously sold secondhand paperbacks and stuff, but he did the proper antique thing, the books that were like hundreds of flipping pounds and millions of years old and all the rest of it. But he had one of those awful. He had a son in the ninth, the same as himself in Eagle House, and he could sort of rattle off, this edition, that edition, and I'm just sort of going, whoa, and yeah, that's amazing, because the whole idea of the history of something, because you would you say that you're an astrological historian? Is that a title that you'd add to your resume?
I would say that today. I couldn't have claimed that when I started out, when I was just learning astrology as a general student, but because I have specialized since the early 2000s in looking more deeply into the history, I would say I have since become an astrological historian.
Mm.
Although I haven't taken a degree in history or a doctorate in history, but I'm an independent astrological historian who has researched the subject from primary sources myself.
Yeah, and primary sources, that's the key thing, isn't it? Actually, from the books themselves, but, from the horse's mouth type of thing. Cool. Because then the other thing you have to sort of think about is, how did they print things then? Was it written by hand? Yeah, that's the point. Would that have been written by hand, the book? Did some poor person sit down and copy that out like they used to do with the Bible, or did that go through a printing press, do you think?
It would have gone through a printing press. The printing press was in commercial use from the mid to late 15th century onwards, and what we tend to find is that books printed before 1500 are ridiculously expensive because there's a special breed of collectors and also institutional collectors that specialize in what they call the incunabula, which are these books printed before the year 1500. They're called incunabula. It's just a term in the trade.
Hmm.
Your brother would have known that, I'm sure.
I'm
So,
sure you've done, yeah.
and because they're so expensive, and also because there weren't that many original astrological works being produced at that time, they were almost all new printed editions of ancient and medieval works, I decided there's no point in even trying to afford those. I decided I was going to start with the original Renaissance works that were within the realm of affordability, given the limitations of my financial situation. And so I haven't, until this particular volume, I haven't gone back before 1550. So this is just 3 years before then. But what you tend to find is that the further back you go in time, before about the year 1600, the more expensive books get, printed books. But there were printed books all the way back to sort of the 1470s.
And so what's on your shopping list now then? So what's the next one that you want to get? You know, this is assuming you win the lottery or somebody funds some money in your direction.
I'm not a gambler at all. I've never been a gambler. There are at least a couple more significant and 16th century works that I would ideally like at some stage. In fact, there are at least 3, one of which is so expensive when it comes up at auction that I can't believe I'll ever afford that, and that would be Johannes Schörner's 3 books on nativities, which the first was translated by Robert Hand back in the early 2000s, and he meant to translate the second and third before he got caught up in his own postgraduate studies, and so it remains to be seen whether he'll have time for that. But there was an auction of quite a lot of early scientific books in the late 2000s, which included that particular book by Schörner, and it sold for $64,000 at auction. And so it's obviously completely out of reach to an astrologer or even to a private individual who's an astrological librarian like me. You know, that may have been a freak result, but even so, it's when something like that happens at auction, it sets an expectation of the future value of a book, and no professional bookseller would accept less than $30,000 for that book today. So that's out of the question. But there are a couple of others, and I would ideally not like to mention what they are beforehand, because
tempt fate.
It creates demand, and if you create demand, prices go up. So
absolutely. But you have them in your mind, definitely.
I have them in my mind as possibilities, but I also have to reconsider every few years, do I really want to be continuing to build up the collection with books that cost thousands of pounds a throw? And I certainly can't afford to do that more than once a year, at most. And whether I'll be able to continue to do it depends on staying in a paid outside job and staying in good health as well. There may come a time when I decide, well, actually, now I want to have more time, perhaps a bit less money, and more time to research and to write and to focus just on astrology and on the creative things I love, and less money earned from an outside job. And if I came to that stage, then I wouldn't be able to afford any of these really expensive books anymore. And that's something I have to weigh up in the balance in my personal life trajectory, what the most sensible thing is to do. I sort of feel as though the library is in a good state at the moment. It's well developed with high quality sources throughout history. Even if you take the ancient and medieval authors, then I've got most, if not all, of the critical editions, the academic editions of their books that have been published in the last 150 years or so. There may be 1 or 2 authors by whom there have been multiple critical editions, and I've kind of felt that the earlier ones, which have been superseded in scholarship by later ones, aren't worth bothering with, but all the authors of importance are represented, and I sort of feel as though I've come to the time when just maintaining the collection with new publications, new affordable publications, including the academic ones, and not trying to spend excessive amounts on really old books unless something really, really important comes up that I can afford. That may be a more sensible way to proceed in the future.
And the other thing is you've got the Internet Archive, which I presume you've used at some point.
Well, the Internet Archive, you mean in terms of accessing the text scans of other
Yeah, because
people?
there's.
Yeah.
I'll just mention to people that don't know this. There's a website called the Internet Archive, and on there there's random people that
Yeah.
have old books, will scan them and upload them, regardless of whether or not they're still in copyright, which drives me crazy. But they also have access to books that are in legitimate libraries.
Yes.
Quite a lot of them American libraries as well, and ancient texts things in there, because I was looking for Cairo, a book of his that I didn't have. He was a palmist.
Okay.
Yeah, and they've got various different copies of the things that that I was looking for that were on there, with some lovely pictures as well, which I didn't realise that they had on there. And it's quite a mix, the Internet Archive, because you've got the legitimate inverted commas editions of things, but that are owned in libraries and stamped and stuff. And then you've got random people that are dotted all over the world that have got some book from somewhere or other
Yeah.
and has scanned it and uploaded it. And it's a big mix. So sometimes you can find like really wonderful ancient texts. Some of them you have to pay a small amount. You can't access everything. There's certain things, the library edition things, you have to either be a member of the Internet Archive or whatever, and there's some sort of charge or whatever. But I know people that have done their research and only used the Internet Archive. They haven't even walked into a library.
Yes, yes. No, it's definitely true that there's quite a good range of historical resources on astrology that has been scanned and is online today. But there's also a lot that isn't, and there's a lot that's still in copyright and certainly shouldn't be, even if it is, and most of it isn't. But as you say, there are people who pay no heed of copyright legislation. They just upload what they want to sites like Scribd and so on, and mostly get away with it, which from the point of view of somebody who has a family of authors, that is a no-no. So.
Yeah, same here. I know that. You just, I mean, it's distressing
Yes.
if you catch it. I always report it. I always report it to
Yeah.
Google if I ever discover it and get it taken down. Cool. So you'd like, God willing or whatever, to steer yourself more towards your own writing. Well, that sounds a fair enough thing to do, eh?
I would definitely like to have more time for creative pursuits in general, including writing and astrological research, and ideally also some time for music, which is something I enjoyed so much before I started building up this library. So I think I have to think in terms of the balance of time for my own productivity and earning power for improving the library, and there comes a point when I'm just going to feel, well, I'm getting too old to keep constantly building up the library in ways that I'm not giving myself time to make full use of, and I will probably move to working less in an outside job and trying to find more time to do my own things.
And so, what would you say was the best thing that astrology has brought you since you discovered it? What would you say still lights your fire?
I would say probably the community of astrologers, meeting people who have studied astrology too, and who, as a result of studying it, have a different enlightened perspective on the nature of reality from the received materialist scientific reductionist perspective that we're all brought up at school in this country, certainly, to believe in nowadays, and which I think is a shame.
And I've got to ask you about your Cancer ascendant. Is it 28 degrees or 29? I think it's
It's
29.
about there, yes. I can't remember exactly
Oh,
myself. To
I've
be
got it
honest,
in
I
front
don't
of
look
me.
at my own chart much. I used to when I was a young student of astrology, and I got to the point when I just kind of didn't want to have that kind of inward-looking attention anymore, and I just wanted to study the history more, and so
Yeah,
uh,
it's 28 degrees, so family is
about
important. Yeah, 28 degrees Cancer, so family is important for you, for sure. Yeah.
yeah, it's important, but I don't see my Cancer ascendant only in terms of family. I see it in terms of compassion and sensitivity and caring for other people and even for animals as well.
Yeah, because when we were first, because I didn't know, couldn't work out what sign of the zodiac you were when we were first communicated, and I kept thinking he must be a Virgo because he's doing this type of
Everybody guesses Virgo,
I
but they're
know,
all wrong.
and you said that to me. Everybody else is Virgo, the good one, and it took. It's like when I found out it was an Aries, like he can't possibly be Aries. But then you got the Mercury in Pisces as well.
Yeah,
I think Jupiter's in Pisces. Yeah, you got
I've
Jupiter.
got Mercury conjunct Jupiter in the
Yeah.
first decan of Pisces.
Yeah, you do, yeah. And you've got your Sun right conjunct your MC, which is rather cool. But yeah, the writing thing, and it's an equal house which I use. You've got Moon in the 10th,
Yeah.
And obviously you've been under the influence of Uranus activating your Moon at the moment. So 10th house is your career. So obviously I can understand you wanted to jack in the other job that you've got, so that you can have the freedom that you need to be able to feel the way that you want to be. So thank you very much for speaking with us today, Philip. Thank you for sharing your wonderful details of the things that you've been up to, and also the library, which is a wonderful thing. And obviously you're waiting for the day when somebody's going to adopt your library for you and pay you thousands of pounds to run it, yes?
Well, that's a little bit of perhaps a slightly simplistic perspective, but I know what you mean. I would like the library to get to a state at which it is managed sustainably and in a way that is ultimately going to be independent of my own involvement, because nobody lives forever, and I would like the library to be a permanent research resource which is going to retain these sources for hundreds of years into the future safely and securely and accessibly to researchers and astrologers.
Yes, and the other thing is, well, you've got modern astrology books in there as well, haven't you? So you've got all the
A
modern
lot of modern ones. I mean, I would say that because the earlier printed books are so expensive, I've had to restrict the absolute quantity. And I do now have, it seems a bit extravagant, I have about 60 books which are at least 300 years old, but I have far more than that that are more recent. And I have a very, very wide range of 20th century publications, including journals as well as books, and not only in English but also in French and German, and a small number in Italian.
Oh, yeah, because you've got other languages. I've forgotten about that because of your multilingual abilities. You're multi-talented, eh?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. I mean, we all have our own talents, and I suppose it's ultimately our responsibility to try to apply them in ways that do the most good in the world, or are the most use to people at least.
Oh, it's fabulous. Thank you very much. Now in a second, I'm gonna stop the recording, but just for the moment, I'm just gonna say thank you very much for
Thank you
being with
very
us
much,
today.
Mary, for inviting me onto your show, and thank you to your listeners for tuning in as well. And I hope you got something out of this.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.